Sources used by Walpilla Radula. Introduction. In History of Buddhism in Ceylon, Walpilla Radula begins his study by introducing the documentary sources employed throughout the book. Instead of presenting a simple bibliography, he classifies the available historical materials into chronological and literary categories. His objective is to demonstrate that the history of Buddhism in Sri Lanka cannot be reconstructed from a single source but must be established through the careful comparison of different kinds of evidence. This source-oriented introduction reflects modern historical methodology and reveals Radula's attempt to combine textual criticism, epigraphy, archaeology, and literary history. Radula divides his sources into 7 major groups: Pali scriptures, Asukan edicts, Ceylon inscriptions, Pali chronicles, Pali commentaries, folk tales, miscellaneous Pali and Sinhalese works. This classification provides readers with a clear understanding of the historical basis of the entire work. 1. Pali scriptures. Radula places the Pali canon at the beginning because it forms the earliest literary foundation of Theravada Buddhism. Although the book concerns Buddhism in Sri Lanka, the canonical texts provide the doctrinal and institutional background necessary for understanding later developments. He explains that whenever later sources describe the life of the Sangha or Buddhist institutions, he compares them with both the Dhamma and the Vinaya in order to trace their historical development. Rather than treating the canon as a complete historical record, he uses it as the earliest benchmark against which later traditions can be evaluated. An important observation made by Radula concerns the formation of the Pali canon. He acknowledges evidence that the scriptures developed gradually during the early centuries of Buddhism in India and Sri Lanka, but argues that their textual form became stabilized by the 5th century CE, when Buddhaghosa translated the Sinhalese commentaries into Pali. This statement establishes the chronological boundary for the canonical tradition. Thus, the Pali canon functions as the doctrinal and historical baseline for his research. 2. Asukan edicts. The second category consists of the Asukan inscriptions, which Radula considers one of the most reliable historical sources for 3rd century BCE India. Unlike literary works, the edicts are contemporary royal documents. They illuminate Emperor Asoka's religious policy, ethical ideals, and administrative reforms, thereby helping Radula reconstruct the Indian background before Buddhism was introduced into Sri Lanka. Radula uses these inscriptions primarily to explain the political environment of Asoka, the spread of Buddhism under imperial patronage, the religious climate of 3rd century BCE India. Because these inscriptions are contemporary evidence rather than later literary traditions, Radula regards them as particularly trustworthy. 3. Ceylon inscriptions. The third source category is Sri Lankan inscriptions, which Radula treats as one of the strongest forms of historical evidence. He explains that written records in Sri Lanka begin only after Buddhism was introduced in the 3rd century BCE. The earliest cave inscriptions simply record donations of caves to the Sangha. Later inscriptions become increasingly informative, documenting grants of land, irrigation systems, monastery administration, taxation, religious endowments, local government. Radula emphasizes that inscriptions are especially reliable because they usually describe contemporary events rather than legendary traditions. He nevertheless notes that inscriptions mentioning ancient events should be evaluated with the same caution as chronicles. Another important observation is that even the shortest inscriptions may preserve valuable historical information in a single phrase, while later inscriptions provide extensive administrative details. 4. Pali Chronicles. Radula next examines the Pali Chronicles, particularly the Dipavasa, Mahavasa, and Mahavasayika. Dipavasa. He identifies the Dipavasa as the oldest surviving Pali chronicle and dates its present form to approximately the 4th century CE. Rather than attributing it to a single author, Radula argues that it is a compilation of earlier traditions collected over time. Its repetitive style and lack of literary organization support this conclusion. He further proposes that both the Dipavasa and Buddhaghosa's commentaries probably drew from common Sinhalese sources instead of one directly copying the other. Mahavasa. Radula discusses the Mahavasa in greater detail. He explains authorship, composition, sources, historical method, literary character, According to Ragula, Mahanama relied upon earlier chronicles, oral traditions, and records preserved by royal families. An important point in Ragula's evaluation is his defense of the Mahavisa as a historical work. While acknowledging its poetic style, he argues that its authors followed their sources carefully and often preserved minute historical details. He also praises Mahanama's impartiality, noting that even Tamil rulers are described fairly when historical evidence required it. Consequently, Ragula concludes that even if the Mahavisa is not a complete political history, it is unquestionably the history of Buddhism in Sri Lanka, and since Buddhism dominated Sri Lankan civilization, it also represents much of the island's general history. 5. Pali commentaries. The fifth group consists of the Pali commentaries, especially those of Buddhaghosa. Ragula considers these among the richest sources for reconstructing Buddhist history between the 3rd century BCE and 5th century CE. He argues that Buddhaghosa should not simply be regarded as an author but rather as an editor and translator of much older Sinhalese commentaries. These earlier Sinhalese commentaries had accumulated historical materials over centuries. Although their original purpose was doctrinal explanation rather than historical writing, they unintentionally preserved valuable information about society, economy, monasteries, education, kings, religious customs. Ragula notes one limitation, Buddhaghosa intentionally omitted repetitions and materials he regarded as unnecessary. Unfortunately, some of these omitted passages might have been extremely valuable for modern historians. He also highlights that many illustrative stories known to Buddhaghosa's audience are merely mentioned rather than fully narrated because they were already familiar traditions. 6. Folk tales. One of the most original sections of Ragula's introduction is his discussion of the Sahasravathu. Unlike earlier scholars, Ragula devotes substantial attention to this neglected text. He examines surviving manuscripts, authorship, language, probable date, literary classification, historical importance. Ragula argues that although the Sahasravathu is essentially a collection of folk narratives, it preserves important traditions inherited from earlier Sinhalese literature. He further explains that during the Anuradhapura period the word Ahakatha had a much broader meaning than it possesses today. It referred not only to canonical commentaries but to many different kinds of historical and literary works. By analyzing terminology, manuscript history, and internal references, Ragula attempts to determine the approximate date of the Sahasravathu. This discussion illustrates Ragula's philological method. He uses linguistic evidence, manuscript traditions, and textual cross-references to establish historical chronology. 7. Miscellaneous Pali and Sinhalese works. Although discussed after the previous categories, Ragula also employs numerous additional literary works written in both Pali and Sinhalese. These include historical narratives, religious manuals, grammatical works, local traditions, biographies, literary compositions. Rather than depending exclusively on famous chronicles, Ragula compares these lesser-known texts whenever they help clarify historical problems. This broad documentary base distinguishes his work from earlier histories that relied mainly upon the Mahavisa. Ragula's historical methodology. Beyond listing sources, the introduction reveals Ragula's historical methodology. Several characteristics are evident. First, he arranges sources chronologically, beginning with the earliest evidence and moving gradually toward later literary traditions. Second, he distinguishes between primary and secondary evidence. Contemporary inscriptions receive greater historical authority than later legendary accounts. Third, he consistently compares different kinds of evidence instead of depending on one document. Fourth, he evaluates every source critically by discussing its origin, authorship, date, reliability, and limitations. Finally, he integrates textual criticism with epigraphy, philology, archaeology, and literary history. This interdisciplinary approach was relatively advanced for studies of Sri Lankan Buddhism during the 1950s. Significance of the introduction. The introduction serves several important scholarly purposes. First, it establishes the academic credibility of the book by demonstrating that Ragula's conclusions rest upon multiple independent categories of evidence rather than upon a single chronicle. Second, it provides readers with a historiographical framework for evaluating each chapter. Third, it introduces several understudied sources, particularly the Sahasavathu, thereby expanding the documentary basis for future research. Fourth, it shows Ragula's balanced historical attitude. Although he was a Buddhist monk, he evaluates traditional sources critically, acknowledges their limitations, and distinguishes between historical evidence and religious tradition. Finally, the introduction illustrates how Buddhist history should be written through the careful synthesis of canonical literature, inscriptions, chronicles, commentaries, and archaeological evidence. Conclusion. The introduction to history of Buddhism in Ceylon is much more than a preliminary chapter, it is the methodological foundation of the entire book. By classifying his materials into 7 groups, Pali scriptures, Asukan edicts, Ceylon inscriptions, Pali chronicles, Pali commentaries, folk tales, and miscellaneous Pali and Sinhalese works, Ragula demonstrates a rigorous historical approach grounded in source criticism. Rather than accepting traditional narratives uncritically, he evaluates each category according to its date, origin, reliability, and historical value. His combination of canonical texts, inscriptions, chronicles, commentaries, and lesser-known literary sources produces a comprehensive framework for reconstructing the history of Buddhism in Sri Lanka. Consequently, the introduction stands as an important example of modern Buddhist historiography and explains why Ragula's work remains one of the most influential scholarly studies of Sri Lankan Buddhist history.